There is a version of orc history that almost nobody in the galaxy remembers. Not the usual story. Not the roaring mobs, the rusted guns, the slapdash engines, and the green tide thundering across another doomed world. That is the version everyone sees. It is loud, crude, impossible to ignore, and easy to dismiss in the wrong way. But the deeper lore points towards something older, something built for a very different age. The Krork. If that name sounds unfamiliar, that is because the Krork barely appear in the setting at all. They are not one of the headline factions. They do not have shelves of codices explaining their culture, their armies, and their wars. They survive in fragments. A line here, a reference there. A preserved relic in the collection of a being old enough to remember ages that the Imperium would call myth. And that is exactly why they are so fascinating. The Krork sit at the edge of Warhammer 40,000's deepest past, in that haunted territory where history starts to blur into legend. They are tied to the war in heaven, to the old ones, and to the possibility that the modern orcs are not the beginning of the story at all. They are what came after the collapse. That possibility changes how you look at every greenskin in the setting, because orcs are already terrifying. They are almost impossible to wipe out. They spread through spores. They thrive in conflict. They can turn a battlefield into a breeding ground and a defeated world into a permanent infestation. They remain wildly effective. Even when they appear disorganized, they can gather into forces so large that entire sectors start to buckle under the pressure. Now imagine all of that as the worn-down remnant of something greater. That is the core of the Krork mystery. To make sense of it, you have to go all the way back to the war in heaven. This was not a war in the way the Imperium understands war. It was not a crusade, not a campaign, not even a civilizational struggle on the scale of the Horus heresy. The war in heaven belongs to an age so vast that most of the current setting can barely describe it without sounding like it is reciting broken scripture. The old ones were there at the height of their power, masters of life and science, shaping species and building pathways through the stars. The Necrons were there too, before the long sleep beneath dead worlds had buried them in silence. The Catan were there, feeding on suns and walking like gods made of hunger. The webway itself was drawn into the conflict. The warp began to churn more violently as psychic species multiplied and the old balance began to fail. In other words, the galaxy was coming apart, and in that crisis, the old ones created new warrior races to fight for them. Among those creations were the Krork. That matters more than it first appears. The Krork were not the product of random evolution. They were not some primitive race that stumbled into power by reproducing quickly and loving violence a little too much. Their existence points to design, purpose, intent. The old ones made them because the war had reached a point where ordinary armies were no longer enough. That alone tells you what kind of beings they must have been. The surviving lore places their creation in the closing disasters of the war in heaven, when the old ones were defending their last strongholds while warp-born horrors tore into reality. The Krork were remembered as formidable enemies in their prime. One ancient reference even says they were the only young race to escape the fear of death imposed by the Nightbringer. That detail is easy to rush past, but it says a great deal. Fear sits at the center of almost every civilization in 40K. Fear of pain, fear of death, fear of corruption, fear of what waits in the warp. Entire empires are shaped by it. Remove that weakness from a warrior race, and the result is not merely brave. It is something much harder to break. Something that can keep coming forward no matter what is burning around it. That is exactly the kind of thing you would unleash in a war for the survival of reality itself. There is another ancient clue that feels just as important. A Necron lord remarks that the Krork had spread throughout the galaxy in numbers comparable to humanity. Whether that line is meant literally or carries some mythic exaggeration, it gives you a sense of scale. The Krork were not a small military experiment. They were numerous enough to leave an imprint on galactic history, and yet their story is mostly gone. That absence is part of the horror. There is no grand surviving chronicle of Krork civilization, no clean record of their empires, their hierarchy, or the exact way they fought. The lore gives only outlines. Ancient green-skinned warriors, created by the Old Ones, connected to the ancestry of the Orkoid race, feared in their time. That is enough to start seeing the modern orcs differently, because even in their current form, orcs do not look natural. They look engineered. Their entire biology feels slanted toward war. They reproduce through spores, which means killing the warriors in front of you often does nothing to solve the larger problem. They contain specialized castes that seem hardwired into their nature. Mech boys do not study in the way human engineers do. They simply know things, or at least enough things to keep the engines roaring and the guns firing. Orcs grow bigger through dominance and survival. A more successful orc becomes a larger orc. A larger orc can command more followers. A greater mass of followers becomes a war, and once a war reaches critical size, the entire thing starts feeding itself. Nothing about that sounds accidental. It sounds like the surviving architecture of a war breed that was built to spread, endure, escalate, and refuse extinction. That is where the Krork stop being an obscure bit of background lore and start feeling genuinely important. Because if the orcs are a damaged inheritance from the Krork, then the greenskins of the 41st millennium are not functioning at full capacity. They are dangerous even now, but something has been lost. The species feels incomplete, as though it is still running on instructions written for a different age. That impression becomes much harder to ignore when the lore turns to Trazyn the Infinite. Trazyn is not a casual collector. He is a curator of vanished ages, a thief of history, a being who preserves moments and civilizations the way others preserve jewels. In his galleries sits a preserved giant Orkoid identified, or at least strongly associated, with the Krork. The descriptions vary depending on the source, but they agree on the part that matters. This was no ordinary orc. Fabius Bile, a man whose standards for monstrosity are absurdly high, sees the thing and is struck by its scale and sophistication. Its armor is described as something beyond what modern orcs should be capable of making. Not scrap hammered into shape, not lucky improvisation. Something advanced, something imposing, something that makes even an observer like Bile stop and recognize that he is looking at a relic from a much higher order of war. That image does a lot of work. It gives shape to an otherwise elusive idea. When most people hear the word Krork, they imagine a bigger orc, but the preserved specimen suggests something more unsettling than that. Not just larger, not just meaner, more complete, more refined in a military sense. A giant built for the battlefield by a civilization that did not think in terms of regiments and borders, but species and epochs. That is where the topic becomes dangerous in the best way. Because now the question is no longer just where the orcs came from. Now the question is whether any part of that older form still survives inside them. This is where the beast enters the conversation. The beast is one of the most alarming things the orcs have ever produced. Not because he was simply huge, though he was. Not because he led a devastating war, though he did. The real shock came from the fact that he shattered assumptions. Here was an orc presence so powerful, so organized, and so advanced that the Imperium had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Under the right conditions, orcs do not just become more numerous, they become something else. During the War of the Beast, the Greenskins did not behave like the kind of enemy the Imperium had trained itself to expect. Their leadership had scale, their strategy had clarity. Their technology moved far beyond the usual image of orcish ramshackle brutality. Around the beast emerged other prime orcs, hyper-evolved giants that looked like a higher expression of orcoid potential. That is one of the most important clues in the whole discussion, because it suggests the orcs are not fixed in place. Their baseline is not their limit. Under immense pressure and overwhelming success, the species begins to climb. Larger bodies, sharper minds, greater coordination, deadlier machinery, bigger ambition. Fabius Bile himself speculates that the Krork may have resembled these higher forms. That does not mean the beast was literally a Krork returned to life. The lore does not go that far, but it does open a very disturbing door. The orcs may still carry buried traces of the original design. The old military architecture may not be gone. It may be dormant, surfacing only when war grows large enough to feed it. That possibility makes the Krork feel much less distant. They stop being a historical curiosity and start looking like a warning about the future, because the current galaxy is exactly the sort of environment that could push the orcs upward again. Endless wars, collapsing worlds, constant pressure, great powers bleeding each other dry across sector after sector. No matter where you look in 40K, conflict is everywhere, and conflict is the element in which the orcs thrive best. It strengthens them, it grows them, it rewards exactly the traits that make them most dangerous. That is the nightmare hidden inside the species. You can beat an orc invasion and still lose the larger war if the fighting itself leaves enough behind for the next generation to rise. You can crush a warband and accidentally create the conditions for something bigger later. You can spend decades containing the greenskins without ever understanding what they were originally made to become. And that brings the whole Krork question into focus. Whatever the Krork were, they did not save the old ones. Their creators still fell. The war in heaven still shattered the old order. The warps still became more hostile. The ancient powers still broke apart. So the Krork were left behind in a galaxy that no longer had any guiding hand over them. What happens to a weapon race after the civilization that made it disappears? Not extinction, apparently. Something stranger than that. The old structure seems to have degraded over unimaginable spans of time. The result is familiar to everyone in the setting. The orcs. Brutal, energetic, wildly effective, often ridiculous on the surface, but carrying deep within them a design that was never meant for peace in the first place. That helps explain why orcs feel so contradictory. They can be funny and horrific in the same moment. They can look crude while doing things that should not work. They can appear half feral one day and then gather into armies capable of threatening the Imperium the next. They feel like a race that has fallen a very long way, but never far enough to become harmless. That is what makes them frightening. Not just their numbers, not just their aggression, not even the spores, though those alone are bad enough. The real horror lies in the possibility that what the galaxy sees now is merely the battered survival state of an ancient bioweapon that once operated at a far higher level. And if that is true, then every great orc empire becomes more ominous than it first appears. Every massive war boss starts to look like more than a brute. Every prime orc begins to feel like a glimpse into deep time. Every huge war raises the same uneasy question. How close is this to the old shape? That question is what gives the Krork their power as a piece of lore. They do not need 100 pages of explanation. They do not need a complete codex. The fragments are enough. Ancient green warriors, old ones, war in heaven, Trazyn's preserved giant, the beast, hyper-evolved orcs, buried potential. The rest of the picture almost assembles itself in your mind, and the picture it forms is grim. The old ones were among the greatest creators in the setting. They built paths through the galaxy. They shaped life. They made warrior races to fight for them when the universe began to slide into catastrophe. Most of their works are broken, lost, or understood only in fragments. But if the Krork truly stand behind the orcs, then one of their greatest military creations never really vanished. It decayed, it fragmented, it forgot itself, but it did not die. That may be the most impressive thing about the design. Millions of years passed. Empires rose and fell. Gods were born in the warp. Humanity clawed its way into the stars and almost tore itself apart. Through all of that, the greenskins endured. They remained one of the hardest forces in the galaxy to eliminate. They remained capable of multiplying, organizing, and overrunning entire worlds. Even diminished, they remained a permanent fact of galactic life. That kind of durability does not feel accidental. It feels deliberate. It feels like the mark of something built to outlast the conditions that created it. The Imperium often makes the mistake of treating orcs as simple. Dangerous, yes. Numerous, certainly. But simple. That is a comforting illusion. The deeper lore suggests something far worse. The greenskins are not terrifying because they are merely savage. They are terrifying because beneath the savagery lies the fossil structure of an ancient answer to total war. That idea changes everything. It changes the way you read the biggest wars. It changes the way you read the beast. It even changes the tone of ordinary orc violence. The shouting, the crude laughter, the barely controlled destruction, all of it stops looking like random chaos. It starts to feel like the degraded expression of a design that once belonged to the deadliest war in the history of the galaxy. And that is why the Krork linger in the imagination long after the details run out. They are not frightening because the setting explains them too clearly. They are frightening because it does not. There is just enough there to suggest scale, just enough to suggest power, just enough to hint that the orcs may be standing on the ruins of a much older and much more dangerous inheritance. That is all the lore needs. The rest happens in your head. You look at Trazyn's preserved giant and wonder what an army of such beings would have looked like marching at the command of the Old Ones. You look at the beast and wonder whether the galaxy briefly saw an echo of that lost era. You look at every orc horde after that and realize it may not be a race at its peak. It may be a ruin with momentum, a living ruin, a battle organism bred in the first great apocalypse, shattered by time, and yet still capable of forcing the entire galaxy to respect it through sheer stubborn violence. That is the Krork in the end, not a fully explained civilization, not a solved mystery, a deep shadow beneath the orcs, stretching all the way back to the war in heaven. A reminder that the galaxy has already survived horrors greater than the ones it currently understands, and a reminder that some of those horrors never went away. They just learned how to survive in another form. Thank you for watching this video, and always remember, the Emperor protects.